In the year 27 BC, Rome finally stopped bleeding. After a century of civil war, of brother fighting brother, of armies marching on their own capital, one man stood victorious amidst the ruins. His name was Gaius Octavius, but the Senate, in a display of calculated gratitude, gave him a new one, a name that sounded less like a man and more like a god. Augustus, the revered one. He promised to restore the Republic, but everyone knew the Republic was a corpse. What he truly offered was something far more seductive than freedom. He offered peace, the Pax Romana. He famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. And it was true. New temples, new aqueducts, new forums gleamed under the Italian sun. The poetry of Virgil and Horace sang of a new golden age, an empire guided by piety, duty, and fate. But if you pressed your ear to that cold, perfect marble, you would hear a sound that was not in the official histories, a sound that was deliberately erased from the glorious narrative of the Augustan age. It was the sound of weeping. Because the same man who built the marble city also constructed a prison of the mind, a gilded cage of laws and social codes so perfectly engineered, so psychologically precise, that it turned citizens into their own jailers and families into instruments of their own destruction. History remembers Augustus as the great moral reformer, a man so dedicated to restoring traditional Roman virtue that he passed a series of laws known as the Leges Julii, the Julian laws. On the surface, they were a noble endeavour. They incentivized marriage, rewarded families for having children, and, most famously, criminalized adultery. For centuries, adultery had been a private family matter. Now, Augustus made it a public crime. A woman caught in adultery would be stripped of half her dowry, a third of her property, and exiled for life to one of the barren, windswept islands that dotted the empire. Her lover would face a similar fate. The state would now enter the Roman bedroom, wielding the full force of law to purify the Roman family. This is the story you were taught in school, the story of a wise ruler saving his people from their own decadence. But that story is a lie, a masterful piece of propaganda that has survived for 2,000 years. Because what those laws actually created wasn't virtue, it was terror, a silent, pervasive terror that operated not in the open battlefield, but in the whispered conversations of the dinner party, in the nervous glances exchanged in the forum, and in the suffocating silence of the marriage bed. To understand the machine Augustus built, you have to understand its fundamental flaw, a hypocrisy so vast it defined the entire era. The Julian laws defined adultery, or stuprum, as a crime that could only be committed with a married woman of respectable standing. A man could sleep with slaves, with prostitutes, with foreigners, with anyone outside that protected class, and it was not a crime, it was simply life. But for a woman of the elite, a single transgression meant social and financial ruin. The law was a one-way mirror. It scrutinized every action of the Roman matron while allowing the Roman patriarch to move through the world with near total impunity. But it gets darker. The law gave a father, the pater familias, a terrifying right. If he discovered his daughter in the act of adultery under his own roof, the law gave him the legal right to kill her on the spot. Not just her, but her lover as well. This wasn't some ancient, forgotten custom. This was a power codified and reinforced by Augustus himself. He was sending a message. A woman's body was not her own. It was the property of her father, then her husband, and ultimately of the state. Her virtue was a public asset, and its violation was a crime against the order of Rome itself. This created an atmosphere of unimaginable pressure. Every Roman woman knew that her reputation was a fragile thing, a piece of glass that, once shattered, could never be repaired. And now the state had given her enemies a hammer. A jealous rival, a spurned suitor, a disgruntled servant, any of them could whisper an accusation. An anonymous letter, a rumour planted with the right magistrate, was all it took to initiate an investigation. The trials were public spectacles, forums for humiliation, where a woman's entire life was dissected for the entertainment of the mob. Her letters could be read aloud, her friendships questioned, her very character put on trial. And in this new Rome, accusation was often tantamount to conviction. But the true horror of the system wasn't the trials. It was the power the threat of a trial gave to powerful men. Imagine a senator who desires the wife of a junior colleague. Before the Julian laws, seducing her was a personal risk, but now he had a new tool, not a tool of seduction, but of coercion. He could approach her not with poetry, but with a threat, whispered behind a column at a banquet. "Be with me," he might say, his voice calm, reasonable, "or I will let it be known that you are with another." Who will they believe? Me, a respected friend of the emperor, or you? The law that was meant to protect her virtue had become the very instrument used to blackmail her into sacrificing it. It was a perfect system of control. It didn't require soldiers or guards. It turned every powerful man into a potential predator, armed with the law itself. And who sat at the apex of this system? The architect himself, Augustus, the man who ruthlessly exiled his own daughter, Julia, for her scandalous affairs, casting her out to a desolate island to live out her days in disgrace. He made a grand public show of his pain, of his commitment to the law, even when it meant destroying his own family. A father's heart, he claimed, was broken, but the father of Rome had to be firm. It was a magnificent performance, but while he was posturing as the grieving father, his own agents were quietly moving through the city, operating a system of procurement that would make Caligula blush. The historian Suetonius, writing a century later, but with access to imperial archives and insider accounts, tells us something that shatters the marble image of the emperor. He writes that even Augustus' friends admitted he was given to adulterous affairs, but it was the method that was so chilling. Suetonius claims that the emperor's wife, the formidable Livia, would help him. She would procure respectable women, even virgins, and present them to her husband. They were undressed and inspected like livestock, lined up for his consideration. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a man succumbing to a moment of passion. This was a bureaucratic procedure, a systematic, cold-blooded consumption of human beings, organised by his own wife to satisfy his desires, all while he preached virtue to the masses and exiled his daughter for the very sins he practiced in secret, on an industrial scale. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was a theology of power. The law applied to everyone but him. His body was the state, and the state could not sin. The bodies of his subjects, however, were merely assets to be managed, regulated, and, when desired, consumed. This was the true face of the Augustan peace, a meticulously crafted social order built on a foundation of sexual terror, where the law was not a shield for the innocent, but a sword in the hand of the powerful. And in the shadowy corridors of the Palatine Hill, that sword was being sharpened, ready to descend upon the next generation of Roman women who would be born and raised in this new world, never knowing what true freedom felt like. They were to be the perfect Roman wives and mothers, or they were to be fuel for the machine. The Julian laws were not merely ink on a scroll. They were a poison that seeped into the foundations of Roman society, targeting the one institution they claimed to protect, the family. The law transformed the Roman household from a sanctuary into a courtroom, and the father, the pater familias, into its chief judge and potential executioner. Before Augustus, a father's power his patria potestas, was absolute but largely theoretical, a relic of a harsher age. Augustus didn't just preserve this power, he weaponized it. By giving a father the legal right to kill a daughter caught in adultery, he wasn't upholding tradition. He was forging a new link in his chain of control. He was forcing every father in Rome to look at his own daughter and see not just his child, but a potential source of public shame, a liability that might one day have to be managed. This legal right was a choice between two forms of destruction. A father could exercise it, becoming a monster in his own home, staining his hands with his child's blood to preserve the family's public honour. Or he could refuse and watch as his family was dragged through the mud of a public trial, their name ruined, their property confiscated, their future obliterated. There was no third option. The law was a perfect trap. It forced men to choose between their conscience and their survival, and in Augustus' Rome, survival always won. But this internal pressure was only half of the machine. The true genius of Augustus' system was how it turned the entire social world of the elite into a network of spies. The laws created a new and lucrative profession, the delator, the professional informant. These were not mere gossips, they were ambitious, ruthless men, often from the lower rungs of the senatorial class, who saw the new moral climate as a business opportunity. The law stipulated that if an adulterous couple was successfully prosecuted, the accuser was entitled to a share of the condemned's confiscated wealth. Suddenly every private conversation, every lingering glance, every secret letter became a potential commodity. The delatores cultivated networks of slaves, disgruntled friends, and former lovers. They were the architects of ruin, manufacturing evidence, twisting innocent words into confessions, and presenting their carefully constructed narratives to the courts. They were the human engine of Augustus' terror. The city became a theatre of paranoia. At a dinner party, a senator would watch his wife, analysing her every smile, her every word, wondering if a guest at the table was a friend or a delator taking notes. A woman would burn her personal correspondence, terrified that a line of poetry from a childhood friend could be twisted into proof of an illicit affair. Trust evaporated. The bonds that held the Roman aristocracy together, friendship, loyalty, shared history, began to dissolve, replaced by a universal, gnawing suspicion. This was not an unintended consequence of the laws. It was their primary function. An elite class that is terrified of itself cannot unite against a tyrant. By turning them against each other, Augustus ensured that the only person anyone could truly trust was the emperor himself. Let me tell you about a girl named Cornelia. She was 17, the daughter of a respected senator named Lucius Vetus, a man known for his stoic adherence to the old ways. Cornelia was intelligent, well-read, and betrothed to a young man from an equally powerful family. Hers was a life of privilege, but also one of immense restriction. Her world was the gilded cage of her father's villa. Her only true confidant was a young tutor, a Greek freedman named Phanes, who taught her philosophy and poetry. They were never lovers. Their relationship was one of the mind, a shared intellectual spark in a world that demanded she be little more than a beautiful vessel for the family bloodline. One afternoon, emboldened by a passage from Plato, Cornelia wrote Phanes a letter. It spoke not of physical love, but of the soul, of a longing for a world where a woman's mind was valued as much as her virtue. It was a deeply personal, philosophical, and utterly innocent letter. She gave it to her most trusted handmaiden to deliver. But that handmaiden had a brother who was in debt, and she knew that such a letter, in the right hands, was worth more than a year's wages. She sold it not to Phanes, but to a known delator who happened to be a political rival of Cornelia's father. The trap was sprung. The delator didn't go to the courts immediately. That would have been too simple. Instead, he approached Lucius Vetus privately. He presented the letter not as a philosophical musing, but as a coded declaration of a sordid affair between a noble Roman girl and a Greek slave. In the hysterical moral climate of Augustus' Rome, the accusation was plausible enough to be fatal. The delator made his offer clear. He didn't want money. He wanted Lucius Vetus to withdraw his opposition to a new tax law that Augustus favoured. The senator was being blackmailed, using his own daughter as the weapon. He was caught in the gears of the machine. Lucius loved his daughter. He knew in his heart she was innocent, but he also knew the reality of the new Rome. A public trial would be a disaster. The letter would be read aloud to a jeering crowd. His daughter's reputation would be destroyed, her engagement broken. His own political career would be over. He would be seen as the father of a degenerate, a man who could not control his own household, and the emperor, who valued order above all else, would cast him aside. He was trapped. To save his daughter, he had to submit to the blackmail, becoming a pawn in the emperor's game. To defend his honour, he had to sacrifice his daughter. He spent a week in agony. He saw the way his colleagues looked at him in the Senate House, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. The rumour had already begun to spread, expertly planted by the delator. He saw the fear in his wife's eyes and the confusion in Cornelius as she felt the atmosphere of her home turn cold and brittle. On the 7th night, another visitor came to his villa. This one was not a delator, but a quiet, unassuming man who represented the emperor's household. He didn't issue threats. He spoke of duty, of honour, of the difficult sacrifices great men must make for the good of Rome and the stability of the state. He reminded Lucius of the law. He reminded him of his right, his duty, as a paterfamilias. He was offering a third option, a silent, clean solution, a way to contain the scandal and prove his loyalty to the emperor's moral crusade in one swift, terrible act. The message was unmistakable. Augustus was not just the author of the law, he was the arbiter of its most brutal application. His agents were everywhere, ensuring the system functioned, ensuring that the necessary sacrifices were made. They were the quiet mechanics of the terror, tightening the screws, oiling the gears, and whispering encouragement to the executioners. That night, Lucius Vetus made his choice. He summoned Cornelia to his study. He showed her the letter. And as she began to weep, to explain, he looked at her with the dead eyes of a man who'd already surrendered his soul. The machine had won. It had taken a good man, a loving father, and hollowed him out, leaving behind only an instrument of the state. The marble city was safe. The golden age continued. And in a quiet room, in a respectable villa, another voice was silenced forever, another casualty of the Augustan peace. The true theatre of Augustus' moral reign was not the Senate House. It was the Roman dinner party, the convivium. In the flickering lamplight of a private villa, surrounded by mosaics depicting myths of gods and heroes, the elite of Rome gathered to forge alliances, display their wealth, and now to navigate the treacherous currents of the new social order. The air itself had changed. Where conversations once flowed with the easy intimacy of a shared culture, they were now clipped, guarded, and laden with double meanings. Every word was a potential weapon. Every joke was a risk. One unguarded comment about the emperor's policies, one too familiar glance at another man's wife, could be reported by a guest and find its way to the Palatine Hill by dawn. The dinner party had become a performance, a ritual of obedience where every guest played their part, their faces masks of polite enthusiasm, their minds racing to avoid a fatal misstep. And presiding over this theatre of paranoia was Augustus himself. He was a frequent guest at these dinners, his presence a quiet, suffocating weight on the proceedings. He didn't need to shout or threaten. He simply watched. His gaze would drift across the room, lingering on a couple for a moment too long, and a chill would descend upon the table. He was a master of psychological warfare. He understood that power was not just the ability to punish, but the ability to make people live in constant fear of that punishment, and he used these gatherings to conduct his own form of moral audit. He would often bring his wife, Livia, a woman whose public image was the epitome of the Roman matron, dignified, modest, and fiercely loyal. But behind that serene facade was a mind as sharp and ruthless as her husbandess. While Augustus observed the men, Livia observed the women. She was the enforcer of the female social code, her compliments a form of interrogation, her questions designed to probe for weakness. She would praise a woman's beauty in a way that hinted it might be a dangerous temptation, or inquire about her children in a tone that suggested she might be neglecting them. She was the gatekeeper of imperial favour, and the women of Rome knew that a single misstep in her presence could mean social exile. But there was a darker, more perverse ritual that often played out at these events, a practice that revealed the true nature of Augustus's power. It was a grotesque inversion of the very laws he championed. Towards the end of the evening, as the wine flowed, Augustus would sometimes signal one of his attendants. The attendant would quietly approach a senator and murmur a summons. The senator's wife was to be presented to the emperor. Not in public, not as an act of overt tyranny, but in the discreet confines of a private chamber. This was not a negotiation, it was a command. The husband was expected to assent with a grateful smile, to treat it as the ultimate honour. He was, after all, sharing his wife with a living god. To refuse to even hesitate would be an act of breathtaking arrogance, an insult not just to the man, but to the divine authority of the emperor. The wife, in turn, was expected to go willingly, her face a mask of serene compliance. She would be escorted from the banquet hall, leaving her husband to continue his polite conversation, to laugh at the emperor's jokes, to discuss the price of grain, all while knowing what was happening in another room. This was the ultimate humiliation, a public and yet unspoken act of submission. It was not about lust, it was a calculated political ritual. By taking a man's wife, Augustus was demonstrating his total ownership of the Roman elite. He was reminding them that everything they possessed, their wealth, their status, their lineage, even the bodies of their wives, was his to command. He was unmaking the Roman family in the most intimate way possible, severing the bond between husband and wife and replacing it with a new, terrifying bond, the shared secret of their violation at the hands of the emperor. The women who were chosen were often trapped in a state of psychological paralysis. If they resisted, they risked not only their own lives, but the complete destruction of their families. If they submitted, they carried the silent trauma of the assault, forced to return to the banquet hall and sit beside their husbands, pretending that nothing had happened. They became living ghosts, their bodies still present, but their spirits broken. One such woman was Lollia Paulina. She was famous throughout Rome for her beauty and came from an ancient and powerful family. She was married to a man who adored her. At a dinner party hosted by the emperor, she was summoned. Her husband, a proud and ambitious man, did what was expected. He bowed his head and thanked the emperor for the great honour. Lollia went. What happened in that room is not recorded, but when she returned, those who knew her saw that the light had gone out of her eyes. She performed her duties, she ran her household, she even bore children, but she was a shell. The experience had hollowed her out. Years later, her husband was accused of treason on a flimsy pretext. His true crime, everyone whispered, was that his wife's beauty had become a source of irritation to the emperor, a reminder of a past he wished to forget. The family was destroyed, their property confiscated. Lollia was sent into exile, where she eventually took her own life. Her story was a cautionary tale, a whispered warning among the women of the aristocracy. It didn't matter who you were, how powerful your family was, or how perfect your reputation. You were not safe. The Emperor's desire was a force of nature, and it could erase you from the world. This system of sexual predation was not a secret indulgence. It was an open secret, a tool of governance. It was the dark, unspoken foundation of the Pax Romana. The peace that Augustus brought to Rome was the peace of the graveyard. Saetua it, stillness born of absolute terror. He didn't need to execute his rivals in public spectacles like the dictators of the past. He had found a more elegant, more insidious method. He destroyed them from the inside out, corrupting their families, breaking their spirits, and turning them into willing participants in their own humiliation. He used their own wives and daughters as hostages. The marble temples he built were monuments to this new order, their perfect, classical lines concealing a rotten core, and the poets who sang his praises were writing an epitaph for Roman freedom. Their beautiful verses, a silken shroud covering the corpse of the Republic. The Golden Age was a lie. It was an age of brilliant, polished surfaces, beneath which festered a darkness that would poison the empire for centuries to come. The man who claimed to be the father of his country had become its ultimate predator, and the home, the domus, which was the heart of Roman identity, had been transformed into the most dangerous place in the world.